The sad truth is, Italy is dying.
Italy's national birth rate has fallen to its lowest level on record.
In Sicily, demographers warn that the shrinking population could drag the country into an unprecedented economic crisis.
And its economy is collapsing with it.
That is their debt to GDP level, currently sitting at around 150%, the second highest in the Eurozone.
Now, the European Commission has warned Italy it will launch disciplinary steps over the country's growing debt.
Yes, I said that. Third time in a decade, Italy's economy has slipped into recession.
Over 24% of Italy's population is over 65, and this number is only rising. We're not the first one to mention this. Italy's very own health minister is also worrying about this. She's quoted saying that Italy is a dying country. So what's the problem? What's killing Italy? It has to do with two words: fertility rates. This refers to the number of babies each woman has on average. The fertility rate in Italy is one of the lowest in the world, with a number of 1.24 births per woman. To maintain a stable population, you need a fertility rate of about 2.1. Because of this fact, Italy's number of 1.24 is making its population very unstable. So unstable, in fact, that a population collapse is not only coming, it's inevitable. For years now, Italy has had fewer births than deaths, slowly chipping away at its total population number. In 2022, the country recorded a record low number of births. It had less than 400,000 newborns, with a total population of about 59 million people. Imagine that. For years now, the country's population has been falling by around 200,000 every year. This huge population decline began back in 2015, and the trend is only worsening. Keep in mind that a population decline is inevitable when birth rates stay low. Every new generation could just become smaller and smaller, to the point of no return. Elon Musk is worried about this possibility, saying that Italy will have no people if these trends continue. This is no exaggeration, as it is happening in some places already. Around 6,000 rural villages in the country have been abandoned, and 15,000 could soon follow. The rapidly aging population is the main cause of this, as once thriving villages have become empty ghost towns. And this isn't the only effect of the aging population, or even the biggest one. Demographics are one of the most important statistics for a country, because they play a role in almost every system in society. The economy, politics, and the welfare system are all closely intertwined with demographics. And that's why a demographic collapse is a terrible thing, because it causes all kinds of systems to crumble. These problems won't just remain in nursing homes, but they will plague the entire society. If these unstable birth rates continue, Italy is in for a time of nationwide unrest and economic downturn. Let's go over how this dire situation formed in the first place. We'll also look at all the problems that will emerge in Italy due to the ongoing demographic crisis. But before we continue with the video, here's a quick reminder to hit the like button down below. Topics like these are important to cover because they inform you about the fate of entire nations, but we can only make videos about these topics with your support because otherwise the YouTube algorithm will suppress them. If you want to support the channel, please like the video and leave a comment down below. Without further ado, let's go into the basics. Right now, the country's demographic collapse is going on in full swing because of extremely low fertility rates. But just 50 years ago, the situation in Italy was a whole lot different. In the 1970s, the fertility rate was about 2.5, meaning that the population was steadily growing. But still, a rate of 2.5 isn't that much according to historical Italian standards. 100 years earlier, Italy had a fertility rate of about 5, double the number of 1970. However, this doesn't mean that the average family had 5 children. One of the causes for this high statistic was the sad reality of infant mortality. In Italy of the 1800, around 40% of newborns didn't make it past the age of 5. But in spite of this, the population was still growing throughout the 19th century. The entire phenomena of an aging population just didn't exist at the time. The question is why? What has changed over the last 100 years that made fertility rates plummet? First of all, the incentives for having children changed. Italy was a mostly agricultural society in the 19th century, although the country was slowly industrializing. This meant that for most Italians, having kids was a no-brainer. If you didn't have kids as a farmer, there was nobody to take care of you once you got older. The centralized state as we know it now didn't exist back then. So there were no pensions and no social security. Having children was necessary for your future self. On top of that, there was actually a financial incentive to get kids during that time. There was no law banning child labor, and it was common practice all over Europe. Children worked in the fields or in the workshops of their families, providing a source of labor and income for their parents. Children were actually a net positive for their parents' wallets. During the early days of the Industrial Revolution, parents even sent their children to work in factories. This terrible practice gave poor families a desperately needed source of income. Apart from these social and economic incentives, there was also cultural and religious factors making the birth rate so high. 100 years ago, having a large family was very much respected in Italian culture. Raising and being part of a large family gave people a certain social status. The family culture is one of the reasons why the Italian mafia is so infamous, with families fighting entire wars. This just shows you how serious family is in Italian culture. Another influence was the Catholic Church, which had a lot of power within the society back then. It says that large families are a blessing from God and that it's virtuous to raise children. This moved people in their beliefs, resulting in higher birth rates. But all of these reasons to have kids came crumbling down during the 20th century. Social, economic, cultural, or religious, everything has changed. This can be seen in the numbers. Over the course of 100 years, fertility rates were slashed by about 70%. Now, how did this happen? First of all, having children isn't a no-brainer like it was previously in history. Right now, Italy has a free or low-cost healthcare system, a state pension system, and various other social security benefits. Basically, the need to have children to take care of you is gone. Italy's government takes care of people financially and physically, which reduces the need for children in the first place. In some ways, these government policies have caused the decline in birth rates. However, the government isn't the only one to blame for the problem. In the modern world, there's also no financial incentive anymore for having kids. Child labor has been abolished, which everybody can agree on is a good thing. But on top of this, the financial burden of having children has also dramatically increased. From age 0 to 18, the average cost for the parents is now about 175,000 euros in Italy. This varies between higher income and lower income families, with the latter spending less generally. But still, that's about 10,000 euro a year on average for just one child. The average Italian makes about 30,000 euro a year, so good luck raising multiple kids. Having just one baby costs more than 30% of the average income, so raising more is a luxury that most Italians can't afford. Pope Francis has blamed this issue on savage free market conditions. He said that starting a family is a titanic effort, something that only the rich can afford. Looking at the numbers, he's got a point. If it's unaffordable for the average couple to have 2 children, there's arguably something wrong with the economy. So the bad side of the Italian economic system also plays a role in the issue. Another cause of the birth rate collapse is the giant cultural shift that has been taking place since the 1960s or so. We're not going to get political here, but the culture shift definitely has an impact on birth rates worth mentioning. Starting a family was part of a traditional worldview, which was widespread a few hundred years ago. But with the rise of countercultures, these traditional ideals have become less and less important in society. The rise of feminism is directly linked to lower fertility rates, which is proven in a majority of studies. Because of these movements, the traditional idea of having large families has been abandoned. This happened all over the Western world, including in Italy. In some way, lower fertility rates have become the new cultural norm. And this isn't only a cultural shift, but also a religious one. As it did in many European countries, religion has become less and less important in Italy. Traditionally, the country had a vast majority of Roman Catholics, and looking at the data, about 80% of Italians still call themselves Catholic in 2021. But when it comes to actual church attendance, well, the numbers are much lower. In 2020, about 12 million Italians went to church every week, which is around 20% of the population. The vast majority of this group are elderly, and the percentages among newer generations are much lower. It's safe to say that the newer generations are less religious than 100 years ago. Now, a religious population has a higher fertility rate on average according to scientific data. As Italy is becoming more of a secular country, fertility rates have been dropping as a result. In short, it's clear that the demographic collapse doesn't have just one cause, but many. Government policy, economic incentives, and a cultural shift are just some of the major ones. But apart from having many causes, a birth rate decline will also have many effects.
And that is their debt to GDP level, currently sitting at around 150%, the second highest in the Eurozone.
Now, the European Commission has warned Italy it will launch disciplinary steps over the country's growing debt.
Third time in a decade, Italy's economy has slipped into recession.
So we now understand the reasons behind the plummeting birth rates. But it's even more interesting to look at what will happen in the future, and it doesn't look good in many regards, especially economically. Because of the demographic crisis, Italy is heading for an economic collapse. This might seem an overstatement, but sadly, it's not. The country already has one of the weakest economies in Europe when we look at the data. Italy is one of the few developed countries that barely grew its GDP over the last 20 years. When we look at GDP at purchasing power parity, which basically adjusts the number for inflation, the country's economy hasn't grown at all. Compared to France or the United Kingdom, it's clear that Italy is an underperformer. While other countries have grown their economy, Italy has gone into recessions 3 times over the last decade. Right now, there are fears that it will enter a 4th. It's no exaggeration to say that the country is having a hard time economically already. Sadly enough, the demographic crisis will make this even worse. You see, birth rates are a key part of economic prosperity, and low rates can cause economic downturn. Just to be concise here, high birth rates aren't traditionally associated with economic success. Economic development usually goes hand in hand with lower birth rates, as countries with higher rates are mostly underdeveloped. But we have to make the difference between low birth rates and extremely low birth rates. When they are so low that they cause a population to collapse, an economic downfall is inevitable. You don't have to be an economist to understand this. The fewer people there are, the fewer customers and workers for Italy's economy. If there are fewer people to buy and produce goods and services, you have an economic contraction. So this population decline will have a negative impact on Italy's GDP growth in the long run. This sets Italy up to be an underperformer far into the future. In the short term, we'll also see another problem emerge: extreme labor shortages. If you do the math, a fertility rate of 1.2 means that every generation shrinks by about 40%. So the younger generations in Italy are shrinking at scary rates. This is having a huge effect on the labor force because there are the people who are supposed to work jobs. According to a prominent Italian businessman, the upcoming labor shortage is a ticking time bomb. Soon, businesses will start to leave the country because there just aren't enough people there. When companies start leaving the country, an economic downturn is inevitable, and the problems go far beyond that. Because of a lack of people, the Italian government is struggling to get projects off the ground. A recent example of this are the infrastructure projects that were paused this year. To get its economy back on its feet, Italy has recently received 191.5 billion euros from the EU. However, the infrastructure projects that were supposed to be funded with this money couldn't be started. Because of labor shortages, Italy isn't even able to invest in its own economy. And no wonder. With current trends, 110,000 to 120,000 fewer students enter Italian classrooms each year. So the amount of people in Italy's schools will decline by 1 million within a decade. This will cause problems both for companies and the government, because there just aren't enough people to fill the jobs. To make it even worse, Italy is also facing a huge brain drain. Around 50,000 young people leave the country every year to find better jobs elsewhere. In France, Germany, or Switzerland, salaries are way higher, meaning that young Italians would rather work abroad. Many of the people who end up leaving are degree holders, which is a relatively small group in the country. Only 28% of Italians between 25 and 34 hold degrees, far below the European average of 41%. This means that the country has a very small pool of highly educated people, many of whom end up leaving. This lack of talent could help with Italy's economic demise, because the country's economic growth relies on it. When Italy doesn't have enough scientists, engineers, or software developers, it won't be able to compete in the modern economy. There's already talk of a skills shortage in the country, with companies struggling to find qualified employees. This is just another reason for businesses to leave and for Italy's economy to underperform. So the overall economics of the country don't look all too exciting. On a government financial level, it's just the same. Italy's national debt burden is the 4th biggest in the world, with its government building more than 156% of the country's GDP in debts. The government has consistently run into budget deficits because it can't finance all of its expenses. With one of the biggest debt burdens in the world, investors fear that Italy is becoming a risky place to put money into. Italy wouldn't be the first country to run into problems with its debt, as it has already happened during the Eurozone crisis. Starting in 2009, multiple EU countries were unable to repay their debts. These countries were Greece, Cyprus, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland. Because EU countries share the same currency, this crisis affected the entire Union as the euro depreciated in value. It also sparked controversy within the Union because the richer countries like Germany didn't want to bail out other member states. They said that the unsustainable debt levels weren't their problem. Countries like Greece were to blame for not being frugal enough, according to some EU members. Because of these internal issues, the Eurozone crisis has threatened the very existence of the EU. When we look at it from a historical perspective, the debt situation in Italy is a ticking time bomb, and the demographic crisis might be the spark to ignite it. You see, the Italian government needs to do two things financially. First of all, it needs to spend money on public services, infrastructure, defense, and whatnot. Things like these are essential to keep a country up and running. But in order to spend this money, the government needs to collect money through taxes. And this is where government in Italy is running into issues because of its rapidly aging population. A majority of the taxes come from economically productive people, which means people working jobs or running businesses. But this economically productive population is shrinking every year because of the low fertility rates. We've already discussed how every newer generation is shrinking by 40%. Inevitably, this means that tax revenue will go down when tax rates don't go up. To make matters even worse, government expenses will only rise in the upcoming decades. The average life expectancy in Italy has risen significantly over the last decades, meaning that the older generations live longer. For the Italian government, this can be a huge problem. Elderly people don't bring as much tax revenue, but they cost a lot in the form of healthcare and pensions. So this part of the population is a net negative for the national finances. And slowly but surely, the elderly part of the population is becoming bigger and bigger. According to this chart, the elderly share of the population is rising with 0.3% a year pretty consistently. Because of these demographic trends, Italy is going to have lower tax revenue and higher government expenses. For a country already heavily indebted, this is not sustainable. The Italian government will be running at an even bigger budget deficit, which can't continue without causing problems. It has two choices. Italy can either dramatically cut government expenses or dramatically increase tax rates. Oh yeah, the third option is to keep printing money like it's doing now, but we all know how that one ends. With financial disaster, of course. So, the government is in a difficult place financially, to say the least. Right at the center of all their financial problems is the country's pension system. Because of the way that it's organized, this pension system is in a dire situation. Like many other European nations, Italy has a centralized pay-as-you-go pension system. In pay-as-you-go systems, the currently employed population pays for the retirement of the retired population. Basically, this means that the younger generation is supporting the older generation's retirement, but you can see where this goes sideways. In the near future, this type of system should collapse because of aging populations. For one, the sheer amount of pensions Italy has to pay is getting out of hand. The country spends about 70% of its GDP on pensions right now. Yes, that's 17% of the entire economy. This figure will only get worse in the future because of the demographic collapse. First of all, the percentage of retirees in Italy's population is growing rapidly. This means that Italy will need to pay more and more people in the future, relatively speaking. But on the other hand, the younger generation is rapidly shrinking, and this younger generation is the one who's supposed to pay for the retirement of the elderly. In short, the Italian retirement system is headed for collapse. To truly reveal how bad it is, let's look at the old age dependency ratio. This statistic is the number of retirees for every person in the working population. Right now, Italy has about 38 elderly people for every 100 people in working age. But according to OECD projections, this will increase to more than 70 by 2050. This means that everyone within working age has to support about 70% of someone's pension, roughly speaking. That equals to about 9,000 euros every year, or 30% of the average Italian's income. So Italians within working will have to pay about 30% of their income to fund someone else's retirement. This, of course, is not very feasible, as it would be a huge burden on the younger generation. Politicians in Rome are scrambling for solutions to deal with this issue, with attempts to try and reform the retirement program. Over the long term, Italy may be able to abandon the pay-as-you-go pension system. When every generation pays for its own retirement, it would be much more stable. But such a transition would take multiple decades because the current older generation is still dependent on the younger one. The government in Italy can't leave retirees on their own because they are still entitled to receive pensions from the government. That's why the pension reform is going to be slow and painful. But the question is, if Italy has multiple decades left before its pension system collapses, the government in Rome is already facing huge budget deficits, and its national debt is also getting out of hand. If the country has to spend billions of euros extra on pensions, that could be the last straw.
Early results from Italy's election show a clear victory for an alliance of right-wing parties.
Some 31,000 or so migrants have arrived here in Italy on the sea route in the last couple of months of this year. Now, compare that to 2021 and 2022, it's 4 times the number.
So it's clear that Italy faces a lot of headwinds because of its demographic collapse. This will, of course, have a big impact on politics in the country, as it will have to deal with economic and governmental problems. But one thing is clear, because Italy is a democracy, there will be one winner in the upcoming political debate: the elderly part of the population. The parties supporting old people will have the biggest political say in Italy, because they have the most votes. Undoubtedly, this will create a lot of societal tension. Old people want to keep the retirement age low, receive their pensions, and retain free healthcare. The problem is that Italy can hardly afford these things in the future. When the old generation wants to keep all the benefits, it comes at a great cost for the younger generation. First of all, the government needs to increase tax rates to fund the welfare programs for the elderly. Increasing tax rates comes with huge economic cost, as businesses and people will leave the country, so high tax rates would hurt the economy and therefore the younger generation. It will lead to an economic decline and worse living standards for the newer generations. If the government increases its taxes, it's basically sacrificing its economy for the welfare of the elderly. The only other way to keep the welfare programs running is government debt, but there are limits to how much money Italy can lend, because of the risks associated with it. In the European Union, countries are officially only allowed to have 60% of their GDP in debt. This is to prevent something like the Eurozone crisis from ever happening again. However, many countries don't listen to this rule, with Italy currently having 144% of its GDP in debt. This puts Italy in a tricky position. Other EU countries, especially Germany, don't want Italy to increase its obligations. When Italy borrows billions of euros more, it will create tension with other EU countries, and even if the country manages to borrow more money, debt still carries a cost. Everyone knows that borrowed money is never free money. High government debt leads to a high interest payments and inflation. In 2022, Italy had to pay 4.4% of its GDP on the interest payouts for its debt, or close to $90 billion. Increasing debt even more will make these interest payouts even bigger, to the point where it's unsustainable. On top of that, government debt also has a tendency to cause inflation. If the Italian government pumps billions of euros into its economy, the total supply of money increases. According to basic economic theory, an increase in supply makes the value go down. This is also known as inflation. When the Italian government funds its welfare with debt, it would lead to economic unrest. The younger generation will suffer from this the most, because they need to pay the interest on the national debt. On top of that, inflation will cause the generation's living standards to go down. The retirees have less of a problem with this, because their pensions are inflation adjusted to some extent. In short, the younger generation is in a bit of a pickle. It will carry the cost of the demographic collapse, but the generation has very little political say. To prevent it from getting completely out of hand, the government in Rome will have to make a difficult decision. It has to increase the retirement age, which is currently at 67. A higher retirement age decreases the expenses for government welfare and increases tax revenue from workers. The problem is, nobody likes a higher retirement age. If Italy increases it to, say, 70 years old, mass protests and riots will follow. Just look at what happened in France just after Macron raised the retirement age there. But maybe it's better to have short-term anger than long-term political unrest. If the retirement age isn't raised, high taxes, government debt, and inflation could cause mass protests and riots just as well. This is a very difficult political problem, which definitely causes some headaches in Rome. Another political problem is an internal one. You see, Italy's decline isn't spread evenly across the nation. The southern parts of the nation have it way worse than the northern parts in virtually all aspects. It is said that Italy has the most geographically divided country in the European Union. The northern region of Lombardy has more than double the GDP per capita as the southern regions of Calabria or Sicily. Cities in the north have actually experienced growth over the last decades, but the economy in the south has been stagnant. We can see this in the figures of regional growth. The southern region of Calabria has only grown its GDP by 1% from 2010 to 2019. But the northern region of Trentino Alto Adige has grown by 21% over the same time period. This north-south difference is true for many regions, with some exceptions. Right now, the north of Italy is relatively rich for EU standards, but the south relatively poor. There are also some regional differences when it comes to fertility rates. Trentino South Tyrol has a fertility rate of almost 1.6, whereas Sardinia has one just under 1.0. Rates are fairly low throughout the country, but some areas have more acute problems than others. A fertility rate of 1 makes every generation 50% smaller, which is an insane experiment to run. Now, the variation in fertility rates isn't completely a north to south divide. Sicily, for example, has a fertility rate of about 1.4, the second biggest in Italy, But the differences in fertility rates aren't the main issue here. An even bigger factor is the mass migration of people in southern Italy. Almost 50% of the people leaving Italy come from the south, which means that the region's brain drain is disproportionately large. Another form of migration is the internal migration from southern to northern Italy. This internal migration isn't a new phenomena, as millions of Italians have moved up north since World War II. And no wonder, the salaries in the northern industrial cities are just way higher. The huge difference in GDP per capita are the main reason for this. Over the years, this has led to the populations of southern cities like Naples or Palermo dropping by the thousands. The problem is this: the biggest group of people who are leaving are in the age of 15 to 34. This means that the aging problem in southern cities is way worse than in the prosperous northern cities. If Italy is facing shortages in its workforce, the southern cities are the first ones to get in trouble. For the Italian government, this obviously brings some challenges. If the differences between the north and south continue to grow, it'll be hard to keep the country unified. With a huge divide in GDP per capita and economic success, northern Italy and southern Italy are just worlds apart. The demographic collapse will make this even worse, as southern Italy will feel the blow even more acutely. Another hot topic in Italy's politics is immigration, which is also related to low fertility rates. Right now, about 9% of Italy's population are foreigners, representing around 5.2 million people. This number has grown significantly over the last 20 years, because it was only 1.3 million in 2002. Most of Italy's immigrants come from poorer European countries, with 47.6% of immigrants coming from Europe. Interestingly enough, about 2 million of the immigrants in the country were born in Romania, being the biggest group of foreigners in Italy. But Northern Africa, Asia, and Latin America are also places where immigrants come from. 22.3% of immigrants were born in Africa, mainly in northern African nations like Morocco, Egypt, or Tunisia. Immigration from Asian countries represents 22.6% of total immigration. The fastest growing foreign population in Italy are actually the Chinese, with a population of 330,000 people in Italy. The other less substantial group of immigrants are Latin Americans, with about 7.5% of total immigration coming from the region. It's safe to say that Italy attracts people from all over the world. Of course, Italy is a beautiful country where many people would love to live. But the biggest reason for the immigration is actually the demographic collapse. Because Italy just has too few people to work jobs, people from the outside come to fill in the gap. In a way, immigration is compensating for the extremely low birth rates. But it doesn't come at a low cost, because there is a lot of opposition in Italy against migration. The country now has a right-wing government led by Prime Minister Meloni, which is opposed to mass migration. Recently, Meloni has said that migration isn't the way to solve the demographic crisis. If the birth rates continue to be as low as they are now, immigrants would make up an increasingly bigger part of the population. The right-wing government is afraid that this would change Italy's cultural identity and cause internal unrest. As many countries in Europe are shifting right, there's a good chance mass immigration will come to an end. Although some on the left see immigration as a solution for the population collapse, it won't happen because of the political reality. To sum it all up, it's clear that Italy is in major trouble. Because of financial, cultural, and social changes, fertility rates have collapsed in the country. This is going to cause extreme workforce shortages and an overall economic decline. The country is already an underperformer in Europe, something that could be worsened by the demographic collapse. Italy is starting to run into huge fiscal issues, with the government already loaded with trillions in debt. The welfare state with its pension system is completely unaffordable because the population is rapidly aging. Because of these problems, Italy is also headed to a difficult time politically. The younger generations will have a hard time supporting the elderly, which causes friction in society. With the huge south to north regional divide, Italy will become more divided than ever, and the left and the right will be fighting on whether immigration is a good or bad thing. Because of the upcoming demographic, economic, and political crisis, it's safe to say Italy is dying.